Hello everyone, my name is Björn Hassler and I'm professor in environmental science, environmental social science, I may add, since I have a background in political science at Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden. My brief presentation is based on some early thinking on a new research project that we are planning at my department. I hope that you excuse me for not being so precise in this presentation, but this reflects the early stage of this work. On the other hand, this means that we have plenty of opportunities to address comments and suggestions from you, so we would be most grateful for this. Our thoughts about this project originates in some frustration, I would say, or that although it can now be said that it has been firmly established that human activities cause global warming and that rising temperatures is and will be even more so a serious problem. There are few examples of systematic and well-reasoned and effective policies to really improve mitigation. In the words of William Nordhaus, economist and winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics a couple of years ago, the climate problem is no longer a natural science problem because we know enough to be quite sure that we should do more to reduce emissions of climate gases. But it's rather a social science problem because apparently, given that we still have not even managed to reduce emissions much, not at least globally, we still don't know how to effectively and efficiently address the climate problem. Or maybe rather, we have not really doing what we need to do. Of course, there are no lack of attempts to reduce climate gas emissions, ranging from clearly effective tools, such as taxes on carbon dioxide emissions, to not so effective ones such as subsidizing electric bicycles or other rather populistic policies that do not really matter much. Given that the climate problem is real and serious, much more research and energy should be given to understanding, first, which policies are most effective and efficient, second, how do we make sure that there is some fairness in burden sharing, and three, are there policy tools that we think are most effective? Are they also realistic? Clearly, effective and efficient tools that have no chance of being realized are quite uninteresting, I would say. For example, there are researchers who argue that so-called degrowth is the best way to reduce climate gas emissions. I fully agree. If we close flying, stop flying, industrial production, private driving, of course, etc., emissions will certainly decrease a lot. But is it realistic that people in general will accept this? And what about the half of something of the population in the world that are poor and struggle to survive? Is degrowth good for them? And what about information? Isn't the problem that if people only knew better, more would be done to curb emissions? Well, doesn't seem so, really. At least there are no clear correlations between education and doing more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The point here is not to say that it's wrong to advocate degrowth, more information, being vegan or something else, if you are an activist. But I think that scientists have a great responsibility to do what we are paid for, finding tools that really work and are realistic. After all, if the scientists are out protesting with Greta, who's going to do the research? Okay, after this a little bit lengthy introduction, I would like to suggest a small component in the larger climate policy framework that we are planning to zoom in on in our planned research project. We would like to depart from the assumption that even though we respect the work of all committed activists and idealists, the kind of change that is needed to address the climate challenge, unfortunately, cannot be achieved by activism and idealism only. That is not realistic, given what we know about human behavior. Activists and idealists can play important roles in many ways, but most people are not and will not be neither activists nor idealists. Therefore, we would instead like to stipulate that for climate policies to be effective, efficient, and realistic, these policies must be valuable to individuals, not only to collectives, to societies. We already know that it would make sense to have, for example, higher taxes on carbon dioxide emissions at the level of society, but the problem is that it does not necessarily mean that most individuals find it worthwhile to contribute. If that was the case, we would probably not have much of a climate problem. Let's take an example to clarify this point. Say that you are considering whether to take the car or walk to work tomorrow. Of course, many factors would influence this decision of yours, but it's clearly not whether you think the climate problem is real or not. Rather, at least from a rationalistic point of view, what matters is how much more taking the car rather than walking contributes to global warming. It's hard to object against that your individual contribution from taking the car this one single day really matters much, doesn't really change things. And this is the question you must answer. What is your personal contribution? Not what do all others do, because you cannot influence what all others do. You can only influence what you do yourself. And that is the basis for your decision. Okay, so admittedly this kind of reasoning may not always hold, but we think that to elaborate a robust and realistic policy framework, we need to make it at least reasonably rational for most individuals to contribute. So the next question will then be, how can we think about such reasonably rational framework? We suggest that one way to address this extremely complicated question is to focus on two mechanisms that we know can influence individuals to change behavior: group pressure and collective action. We will focus mostly on collective action in our planned project, but to make the role of collective action understandable, I think I first need to briefly comment on the role of group pressure in this framework. I guess that we all are aware of the importance of group pressure, for good and for bad. Group pressures can make people do terrible things, but it's also been shown to be a key survival mechanism for the human race, the human being. Humans would never have survived if it were not for cooperation and tribes and other groups, and to keep the group together. Group pressure is necessary for that. Today many things are different, but probably hardwired group pressure remains in our brains. We depart from the assumption that for group pressure to work, individual behavior needs to be observable. In the context of climate policy, we can expect that signaling plays a crucial role for individual behavior. For example, having an electric car outside your house, or even better, solar panels on your roof, probably signal some kind of concern for the climate, despite the fact that having no car would be better, but harder to signal, and despite having solar panels may possibly purely be because of economic reasons. Many other things that would be good for the climate, like having lower temperatures in your house, but also not flying, are more difficult to use as a signal, and they're therefore less efficient in terms of group pressure. It's true that we sometimes talk about plane shaming when you fly too much, but the fact is that your neighbors are quite certain to observe your new Tesla, I would guess, but less certain to understand or even know that you are not flying because of climate concern. In other words, group pressure and signaling are key features of human social behavior, but although this has been studied quite a lot, implications for effective, efficient and realistic climate policy are not yet well understood, I would argue, and therefore not systematically addressed in climate policy as far as we can see. Turning now to the role of collective action in climate policy, which will be our primary focus in the project application, we know that self-interested actors, individuals, countries or other actors can and do cooperate. As long as all involved actors believe that they will benefit individually from cooperation, cooperation can emerge, but does not necessarily do so. Collective action theory has previously most been used to either explain existing cooperation among presumably self-interested actors, and to design models for how cooperation can be facilitated by, for example, extending time horizons, the so-called shadow of the future, making sure that there is an effective monitoring mechanism, exchange of information, and so on. But in this context of climate policy, we think that legitimacy is a crucial factor. Rather than keep shouting louder and louder about the dire consequences if we, that is individuals or politicians, do not do more, we might need more of a pedagogy focusing on the legitimacy of political binding regulations, such as carbon dioxide taxes, energy taxes, but also possibly on prohibition of certain activities. The biggest challenge, we think, probably is related to being able to frame binding regulations on reducing global warming as collective and democratic decision making, rather than to kind of quote, politicians only want to create problems for ordinary people, so to say. After all, it's a bit strange in some areas, for example, everything that is related to private car traffic, paying taxes, building houses, and many other parts being a citizen, is regulated via binding laws. That is what you cannot do. But when it comes to the climate, and especially if it concerns individual citizens, not least in Sweden, effective action seems always to be assumed to build on voluntary behavioral change at the level of the individual. We like to challenge this order of things, but to be able to do this, we think we first have to look into the more details of how climate policy tools are selected, framed and communicated. We are not quite sure yet about the details, but we look at the case of Sweden as being in the forefront in many ways when it comes to environmental protection and sustainability, especially when you ask Swedes, of course, and analyze government bills, public investigations and other policy documents to see how problems have been framed and how narratives are told. But I think I will stop here rather than becoming too speculative about the details of which we have no clear answers yet. But I would really be grateful for your suggestion how to proceed, or if you have any questions when we bring this up for discussions. Thank you very much.